Welcome to Eric Bowman's 10-year anniversary exhibition with Maxwell Alexander Gallery. I just want to say really quickly, Eric and I had a meeting about, 9 years ago, and we discussed what I thought was possible with Eric's work and the direction it was going and how much potential it had. And we kind of laid out a plan, maybe a 5 to 8 year plan of what we should do exhibition-wise and promotion-wise to make sure that the word got out about Eric's work and that collectors were able to purchase it in a way that was meaningful for his career and for the art market as a whole. So this is a big deal for us. 10 years, the kind of culmination of all that, and it all came together. So very quickly, so thank you. Congratulations, Eric. Our moderator tonight, the person who's going to be handling this conversation with Eric, is Amy Scott. Amy is the Vice President of Research and Interpretation and Curator of Visual Arts at the Autry Museum here in Los Angeles. So Amy, thank you so much for being here. And yeah, we're just going to go through some slides. Amy's going to do it how she does it. She's so great at this, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. So
excellent, thanks.
We'll get started.
All right. Thank you for that generous introduction, Bo. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Eric. So I thought we would start with this relatively early work and learn a little bit about Eric from his early days. So you were born and raised in Southern California. Mm-hmm. How did you get into art, and at what point did you realize that you wanted to be an artist?
Well, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. By the way, this is not 10 years ago. A little longer than that.
Amazing progress.
So my dad was a hobby painter, and he had an easel set up out in the garage where we lived in Covina, California in the 60s. And that was the first place I smelled turpentine and linseed oil. And he would paint on the weekends, and I guess in elementary school, I kind of had a knack for drawing. Again, that's not it yet. I think this was like kindergarten, so maybe a couple years after this. I was just drawing things a little more detailed than the other kids, and I got labeled as the class artist, and I sort of took that identity on and just kept working. You know, when you have people encouraging you in the arts, or whatever vocation it might be, that's a big key to keeping you interested and helping you, push you along. So it was really the encouragement of the teachers and my peers.
Did your parents encourage this early interest in art? And I assume that's dad and mom, and is that you? Are you the little guy there?
So that's our dog Frank on the far left. And my dad with a man bun, but he never had one. Long before, and that's me, the dapper guy with the V-neck. And then the little alien is my brother, who is actually here tonight, so now you'll recognize him. And then my mom, and then the key to the whole picture actually is, this was a brand new 1965 Ford Mustang.
Oh, wow.
Which was like the car of the year that my dad got as his first company car. And I knew that was important, so I put that in the picture. Sadly, I only got a B. If you look up there in the right corner, you see that red B? That was my grade. I don't know what the teacher was thinking. How do you give a B to a kid's family portrait like that?
Clearly no judge of art.
Right.
Did you have any early, museum experiences or sort of cultural experiences that were important to you?
I can remember going to the Griffith Museum on a field trip. We probably went, not to the Getty, but might have gone to Norton Simon or some kind of museum like that. But, early on, it was probably movie posters or comic books, commercial art. And that's what I got into actually professionally first. But I don't, other than my dad painting on the weekends and kind of half paying attention to what he was doing, that was a big influence when I was little. Yeah.
So from here, we go straight to this. These are some examples of your early commercial work, and I wanted to show them because I think they really illustrate your storytelling abilities. And of course, so many great Western artists, from Frederick Remington to Charles Russell, Thomas Moran, Ernest Blumenschein, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, began their careers working for the big magazines of the day and developed sort of their powers, I think, both of genre and sort of compelling storytelling. So can you tell us a little bit about what is going on in these images?
So these are both portfolio pieces, and they aren't commissioned jobs. But in between time when you're working on commissioned jobs, the best thing you can do as an illustrator is be working up new ideas to keep your portfolio fresh. So these are just things I assigned myself to do. This one on the left is called Baby Please Don't Go. And that's an old blues standard, and it's been covered by everybody from Muddy Waters to Van Morrison to Ted Nugent. So I came up with the idea, and I decided to use these Dia de los Muertos dolls, or figurines, that you see in festivals in Mexico, Central America. And it's all made up, it's all invented, except for the pot-bellied stove, which I found a picture of online. And because of the stove being at that perspective in the photograph, I built everything else around it to work with that perspective. And then I used a common lighting situation from like the golden age of illustration, where you obscure the light source behind an object, but you can, then you see the kind of dramatic shadows are being cast up because it's a low light. And yeah, so it's just a fantasy narrative piece. And then the other one is a character I invented called the Switch Witch. And she basically supplies parents of unruly children with switches. And you can see in the different pots, I tried to cover all the naughtiness of kids. And, stealing, naughty, lying, sassy. And if you can tell, the pot in the foreground actually says extra bad on it. And those switches have thorns in them. So it's kind of a corporal punishment kind of deal. But the character, the Switch Witch, you don't see her feet because, and if I was an animator, I would have loved to have animated this. The inside of her dress is just filled with dead leaves that rustle as she floats along through the forest. But that's her job, is selling switches to parents. So just a goofy idea, but kind of fun to do.
And are you looking specifically at illustrators from the golden age of illustration?
Yeah, and I look at what I call the dead guys, even now as a fine artist. All my favorites are from 100 to 150 years ago, when I firmly believe fine art and illustration both had a golden age, and we have not matched that level of quality since. There have been pockets and a few artists here and there, I'm not one of them, that are at that level, but across the board, like it used to be 100 years ago, it was just a much higher quality of art. So that's who I look to for inspiration, the dead guys. Yeah.
And around when and what was the impetus for sort of making the leap into fine art from commercial art?
So my career has been a series of just random doors opening and me going through them because they made sense. And one of those doors was, I'll try to tell this really quickly, another illustrator from LA moved up to near where I live in Portland, and he needed some help. He was an airbrush artist, and I was doing a lot of airbrush work at the time. He heard about me, so I did some work with him, and we hit it off as friends. Well, it turned out that he was a high school friend of another artist in this gallery named Tim Soliday. And so when I went down to visit my folks in Long Beach, my friend set me up to meet Tim Soliday. And Tim was doing fine art. He was a plein air landscape painter at the time. And he turned my world upside down and introduced me to fine art and landscape painting. And I realized that that's what I want to do. in one weekend. I mean, I saw what he was doing, and I thought, you know, this illustration stuff, I've had enough of that, but I couldn't leave it because I was making a decent living and I had a family to pay for and a mortgage and all that. So it took about 12 years to make the transition to where I could quit, dismiss my agents in New York that I had as an illustrator, and go full-time into fine art. And Maxwell Alexander was the vehicle to help me do that. And Bo's brother Logan, principal artist in this gallery, was doing Western art in a stylized manner I hadn't seen done before. Most of the Western artists that I had recognized anyway were working in a very highly realistic, kind of straightforward style, lots of historical accuracy and research behind it, and that didn't really appeal to me. I wanted to do things in a stylized manner, kind of my way. So when I saw guys like Logan or Glenn Dean, some of the other guys in the gallery, I realized that maybe I could do this too. So that was kind of a big turning point for me, you know, a decade ago.
So speaking about influences, we both share a love of the Taos Society of Artists, which is the artist group that formed in northern New Mexico in 1915 and really became one of the premier forces in shaping that whole region as a destination for artists. And we've got two examples right here, Ernest Blumenschein on the left and Walter Ufer on the right. Eric and I had a conversation about these paintings, and these are really two of the more sort of compelling paintings, I think, that this entire sort of era produced. How did you discover their work? How did you first come across it?
I think I'd seen it, you know, the Taos Society of Artists in general were having a resurgence before I got interested in Western art. So I'd seen images like this before, and what appealed to me, again, was a stylized, they were very influenced by the modernists at the time, in the early part of the last century. And just their color and the way they approached the subject. In particular, both of these, and I didn't realize this until you put these two together, they both have these crucifix icons that have dresses or dressing on them, clothing. And I don't know, I've never researched it, I don't know if that's a cultural thing that happened with the mashup of indigenous culture and, you know, Western European influence, Spanish and Catholicism and so forth. But that really appealed to me just because it's kind of odd, but interesting. And I actually did the painting, it's dark right now, but you'll see the painting that's over on the wall there. I put a little religious icon. He's a priest in a decorative gown that he's wearing, but he has no arms, and that's in the Cal studio in Taos, one of the Taos artists. So that's an actual icon that he had in his home, you know, 100 years ago, and it was interesting because it's missing its hands, which makes for a metaphor all by itself. But it's kind of akin to these two icons. And, you know, it's just the liberty that these artists, Blumenschein and Ufer, took to incorporate the current culture at the time and to do something different. And just the color, the palette, they were very inventive and very stylized for that time of the century. And that's just a big appeal to me.
And it's interesting that you point out that the Taos Society is sort of enjoying a resurgence in both sort of museum and, you know, art historical terms, and in academic terms, people are starting to revisit and write about them. At the same time that artists like yourself, like Logan, like a lot of the people that you mentioned, and that Bo now represents and whose careers he has really helped grow, are sort of starting to paint. So it's or not starting to paint, but sort of getting into fine art and watching your careers beginning to blossom. So I think there is definitely a link there. I wondered if you could just sort of put your artist lens on these paintings for a moment, either or, and, you know, sort of tell us how it is that you look at these, you know, as an artist, and what it is that you pull out of them specifically that you find so compelling.
Well, okay, so the Blumenschein on the left it's called superstition, and it's there's all kinds of symbolism going on. The background to me, it feels like a quilt, like a crazy quilt with all that color going on. there's a mask over here, he's got the crucifix over there, and then the pottery down here. And then there's a little figure coming out of this, I think it's a wedding vase on the one side, and then some wheat, I think, coming out on the other side. It's just, I may not understand all of the symbolism going on, but it's compelling nonetheless. It's just a beautiful display of color and iconography, and the look on the Indian's face is captivating to me. I don't know, it's one of my favorite Blumen shines. You don't have to know how to explain it all. Mm-hmm. It's if it resonates with you and appeals to you, that's all it takes. And then the Ufer that's called hunger, and the Native Americans are praying on their knees, I'm assuming, down below. So it's a serious depiction of that time period. But again, if you saw the original of this, just the plaster on that kind of adobe wall, and there's all these little tiny nails that are stuck in the wall that were previously holding something up, I guess. But just the texture in that, if you saw the original, is just amazing. So it's just a tour de force.
And there's a combination of sort of, realism and sort of an emotive,
right,
sort of quality that both of these paintings, I think, exude.
That's where I see the freedom for me to do something stylized and still be accepted as representational art,
yeah,
within the subject matter of Western art.
And they tell stories. They're
right,
sort of open-ended stories
right,
that leave a lot to the imagination, whereas you're sort of allowed to layer your own interpretation as to what is going on.
And that's my goal.
Deliberately sort of open-ended.
I just want to start a story and let the viewer decide what's happening or where it's going from there. Yeah.
Well, let's get into sort of the heart of the matter. And each of these paintings, we brought some studies in to show from a couple of the key pieces in the exhibition, and thought that you might talk a little bit about your method, because it's always fun to see studies, because the finished image as it appears, just sort of, as a viewer, it's always as if it just sort of is produced magically almost, and we don't get to see all of the work and all of the thought and preparation that goes into it. So beginning with Evening in the Arroyo, first of all, where is this? And when you're working with the study, are you on site in the landscape?
It's all up here.
Really?
I've painted in places like this, even around here, Pasadena, San Gabriel Mountains. So I'm very familiar with the landscape. But it's pretty much all invented. I did a photo shoot several years ago with this writer. And so for big canvases, I try to do a small study, at least one study, to work out some of the problems and decide what I want to do with the color and the lighting. And the problem with that is the next generation, it always morphs into something different because I change my mind. But it's a good springboard to get me to the next step. So as you can see in the original idea, the horse and rider was completely in sunlight. I had a low sun hitting him, so there's, the horse's legs are casting shadow. And I decided it was too much light going on, and I wanted to do more, make it more of a metaphor of going from darkness into light. So I've got the rider in the finished painting, which is several times bigger. Mm-hmm. This piece is only probably like 6 by 8 inches, and it's acrylic, so it's a small kind of quick study. The bigger version, he's in shadow, but he's going towards the light. I wanted that optimism of moving towards the light area, so I isolated that distant foothill in light and kind of also the big cloud up above. And then I decided I wanted it to be a decidedly Southern California landscape. So I put the big eucalyptus tree as an anchor, a vertical here on the left side. So largely landscapes are horizontal, but I like to have a foil at least once or twice in the picture plane just to balance those two, vertical and horizontal elements. And if I had done 3 or 4 studies, the finish would still not match any of them. Because you work some things out and then you decide, I can improve this in the next step by doing something a little differently. So that's the benefit and the downside of doing the studies. I never follow them exactly, But that's okay, because I make the rules. So.
There are a couple of other major differences in between the study and the finished piece that I've noticed, including the fact that in the finished piece you've created a much more sort of specific pathway for the writer to sort of go from the foreground into the middle distance, which really sort of enhances the sort of journey component of it and the narrative component.
Yeah. So that's what it is basically. I realized if I reset the lighting situation, I could make it more of a statement of a journey. And it's an arroyo, it's a dried out riverbed. And so he's kind of following that. And if you look at the writer, he's turning his head to the side, so he's kind of surveying the landscape as he's walking through. And again, it's up to the viewer to decide what's really happening. Has he gone down this path before, or is this a new view to him? And he's kind of looking around, taking his time. But the main message is he's heading towards the light, and so it's an optimistic kind of viewpoint.
The other thing that I noticed in the finished piece is that the landscape has gotten much more sort of complex. You've added a number of shapes and sort of colors to it, almost sort of like the quilted pattern that you saw in the background of the Lumenschein. It's much more developed.
Well, part of that is I'm not spending a whole lot of time doing this study because I want to get onto the bigger piece. So I did have in mind, especially this middle foothill or mountain, that I was going to develop that more when I went to the finished oil. But I didn't want to spend all the time on the study because, there's enough there to work with. So I took much more time on the larger canvas. And even after I thought it was done, maybe a couple of months later, I still found things I wanted to tweak on it, which was part of the beauty of doing a show like this. I had several of these paintings in my studio for 6, 8, 9 months. And so I could, reevaluate and decide I could push this a little more, bring the quality up a little higher. It's kind of a blessing, cursing, because a lot of times I do paintings and they go right out the door to whatever venue they're going to, but if they sit around, I'll find problems. So it's good and bad. In this case, it's a good thing because I had enough time to get them to where I wanted before I sent them to Bo and the framer, and they ended up here. But yeah, the finish is always going to be way more involved in the study.
We didn't really talk about this before with the illustration work, but you're such a good landscape painter. Did you study landscapes specifically? Do you do pure landscapes?
Well, when I met Tim Soliday, it was a big plein air painting boom. You don't know what plein air is. It's just a French term for painting outside, generally landscapes. And so I was entering plein air competitions and just purely doing landscapes. So I have a lot of mileage there. And then at some point I realized, why not put some figures into these things? Because I can draw people. I've been doing that for 30 years as an illustrator. And that put me in another category. And like Glenn Bean or Logan, pairing a figure or two in the landscape just makes more of a narrative, and it's fun. I like that combination. Did that answer the question? Sorry, I'll get rambling and I'll forget where we were.
No, that was great. I want to talk also about the role of light. You talked about how you use light actually to develop the narrative because it's so profoundly different in the finished painting than in the study. Perhaps we can do that in this next painting where there's a similar sort of difference, Crossroads of the Season. There are many differences between these paintings that we'll dissect, but let's begin with the use of light. Now, in both paintings, and I think in all three sort of pairings that we have here tonight, the light becomes much more sort of dramatic, not necessarily darker, but dramatic, so the shadows and the contrasts really seem to grow. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you develop the light and sort of what role that plays in the story as it's developing in your head. And although the sky isn't as big in Crossroads as it was in Evening, it has this really interesting sort of pattern. It's really abstract and almost sort of otherworldly.
So this mostly has to do with what I changed with the white. Originally I had snow down there by his feet, and I decided, if I'm gonna have snow down there at a low elevation, I ought to have snow up in the hills. And for one reason or another, I can't remember, I decided I didn't want to do that. And so I changed his blanket, obviously, to a white, just a pure white blanket, which was very common back when the Taos artists were painting their models. And and by the way, the person that modeled for this his name is Dwight Concha, and he is, I think, the great-grandson of Ben Lujan, who was Taos's favorite model 100 years ago. And I just happened to get him when I was in Taos, and he was happy to model for me. So getting rid of the white, which was kind of a focal point, being the lightest value in the picture, I decided to change the blanket to white instead. And then I darkened overall the horse and the trees and then the hills in the background, and to kind of make the focal point the white blanket that he has. And then I darkened the sky, but I wanted to get some second value of lighter color up there in the clouds. And I just took the liberty of stylizing those clouds to get some more angles in there. Because everything's kind of organic shape, the rolling hills, the figure with the blanket, the curves in the horse, the tree trunk kind of has an S curve to it. So I wanted some more harder angles in the clouds. And that's kind of something they were doing during the Cubist period back in the early 19th century. So I snuck that in there. And overall, just kind of dialed in the contrast. So everything's a little darker around the figure, and then the white blanket makes him pop more. So I was just taking it from this step to that with some changes and kind of dialing in the light to make a greater graphic impact. So it's not rocket science, it's just, it made more sense to me.
And so in moving, sort of the patch of white, from the ground to the figure, and then that also is echoed in the sort of stripe that is the horse's head and mane, creates a really beautiful pattern. And that's interesting. I hadn't thought about the white as sort of a geometric, almost kind of like offset to the more rounded forms.
Yeah, that's the subliminal stuff. You don't have to recognize it. It's just, it works, Sometimes I do stuff and I realize, well, that works, but I don't know exactly why it does. And then somebody will point that out to me, and I'll go, oh, yeah, I meant to do that.
These paintings, this painting, both of the paintings, but the finished piece in particular strikes me as particularly sort of reminiscent of a painting like Hunger, or some of the really sort of more intense kind of interior scenes that Walter Ufer did. And there are many differences here. We see the increased use of dramatic light, as you were talking about. But the main difference, of course, is the addition of the pot and the basket in the finished piece. And sort of, if you don't mind, kind of walking us through how those pieces appeared, and their placement is so specific and deliberate. And how did you? What was that decision process like?
Well, first of all, I was very fortunate on this last trip I did to Taos. I'm friends with the curator at the Taos Sharp Museum. So E.I. Kaus, I don't know how to say his first name. Anger, Irving Kaus, and Joseph Henry Sharp were both Taos Society artists 100 years ago, and both of their studios were right next door to each other, and also the Kaus homestead. And so that now it's the Kaus Sharp Historic Site. It's a museum and research center for artists. And I made friends with the director there, and he allowed me to go into the Kaus homestead, where I believe it was like either great-granddaughter or great-grandniece of Kaus.
Granddaughter, Virginia.
Granddaughter, Virginia,
Yeah.
Ginny Levitt. I think she just passed away like last year.
She did.
And she kept the house and his studio just like it was when he passed away in the mid-30s. And so it was full of authentic, I believe it's San Juan pottery, San Juan Pueblo. Taos is not known for a lot of pottery. They traded a lot with San Juan Pueblo for pottery and other artifacts. But the Kaus homestead and studio was full of all kinds of great icons, figurines, pottery, baskets, and so forth from the period. And so I got a lot of photo reference of that when I shot. And this is the same, both these figures are the same model. His name is Jonathan Warm Day Cumming, which is a really cool name. And so Jonathan agreed to pose for me there at the homestead. And again, I kind of rushed through the small study, which is, again, it's probably like 7 inches square in acrylic. And so when I went to move to the bigger scale, I made the figures only slightly smaller so I had more background to deal with. And so I wanted to fill in some items that would balance what's going on with the two figures. So I put in a pot that was actually there, and that little shelf that's there is actually where they were sitting in the homestead. And then I added the basket up above. I don't know what they're called, but they're a really shallow kind of basket, probably for putting like a plate, like putting food in or something. But people hang them on the wall for decorations as well. And then we have the authentic drum that Jonathan's playing. I opened Jonathan's mouth in the final version because I wanted him to be chanting or singing. So a little more action going on. And then the same, Jonathan posed for both figures. So the other figure's kind of looking on. And it's obviously a cold night, maybe a winter night. And I wanted it to mimic firelight. So we got to give him a low light, which makes the dramatic upcast shadows. And I felt like the light was too light here in the background. So I dialed the palette way back for the background and then brightened up the white blanket to make him pop more. So it's these afterthoughts I get, after I get this far, it's like, well, how could I improve what I've got here? And that was my solution.
The the second figure in particular, I think sort of adds to the sense of mystery, and sort of the opening narrative of the painting, because we, obviously, the seated gentleman is doing something quite specific, but the addition of the second, it's sort of obvious what he's doing in the moment, but the second figure, his presence is relatively unexplained.
And he's, that's like a traditional way to wrap a blanket. And I wouldn't know how to do that, but Jonathan knew exactly what to do. He's an older gentleman, not too old, he's like maybe late 70s, I'm thinking. So anyway, but he knew how to do that, and it gave such an exotic kind of mystery to it. And he's just standing there observing what's going on, but to me it's very mystical, like you were saying. So that's what I love about that. And they kind of work together as a pair. So yeah, it's you decide what's going on. It's the narrative's up to the viewer.
And you painted this in the study in the Kaus house.
I didn't paint the study there, but I did, do some rough thumbnail sketches. But it was a photo session. I wouldn't ask somebody to sit that long doing that. That would be ideal, and that's the way they were painting back in the day. But that would also be expensive because I compensate the models very well and try to, because they're getting me a real favor. And it's an honor to have, indigenous, local natives who have history with that region and with the art that was happening, 100 years ago, pose for me. But yeah, I had to do photos to work from.
It's extraordinary work. There's so much going on in what appears to be like a relatively simple composition, but listening to you talk, we realize that it's not. I really only have one last question for you, which is that, is there a, sort of a guiding narrative to your work, or is there sort of any sort of like overarching sort of thesis or story that, sort of weaves its way in and out of the works? Or are there certain emotions? Maybe a better way to ask that. Is there certain emotions that you're, trying to elicit or that you hope people sort of read into the work?
There is some of that. I'm not lucky enough to have that much reference to work with. I kind of build on what I've got. I did I probably shot, 600 photos, of 3 different models while I was there for 2 days. And you go through those and you edit out the ones that you probably can't use, and you whittle it down to what you can use. And then, like being a viewer looking at the finished painting, I'm looking at the photographs thinking, what is this saying to me? What can I do with this information? And so that's where it starts. And then it kind of develops on its own. But each piece is an individual product or project, so I'm not really linking them all together, other than the fact that it's all Western subject matter. I've got American cowboys and American Indians, and I just did the best with what I had to create some kind of narrative, and the rest is up to you guys.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
We'll turn the lights back on and let's look at the real thing.